In the summer of 1876, three women stood at the edge of a fresh grave in the hills of eastern Tennessee. Each one claimed to be the wife of the man being lowered into the ground. Each one wore a black veil and carried a gold wedding band. And each one swore that Thomas Blackwood had visited her bed every night since his death 2 weeks prior. The townspeople called it blasphemy. The preacher called it the devil's work. But what happened in the months that followed would make even the most devout in Hollow Creek question what truly lies beyond the grave. The first strange thing about Thomas Blackwood was that no one in Hollow Creek could agree on what kind of man he had been. To some, he was a charming business owner who'd brought prosperity to their remote mountain town. To others, he was a swindler who appeared from nowhere 5 years earlier with too much money and too many secrets. What everyone did agree on was that Thomas Blackwood had officially married Mary Campbell, the daughter of the town's most respected family. They lived in a handsome 2-story house at the edge of town, where Mary kept a beautiful garden and Thomas ran his dry goods business. When Thomas's body was found at the bottom of Raven's Gorge, most assumed it was a tragic accident. The path along the ridge was treacherous, especially in the dark. Mary wore her grief with quiet dignity, arranging for her husband to be buried in the Campbell family plot. That's when Josephine Miller arrived. Josephine stepped off the eastbound train the day before the funeral, dressed in expensive black silk that immediately marked her as an outsider. She marched straight to Mary's home and demanded to see the body of her husband. The resulting confrontation drew a crowd. Both women produced marriage certificates. Both women wore identical gold bands inscribed with the same date. And both women claimed Thomas had been a devoted husband who'd simply been away on business when visiting the other. But the real shock came when Elizabeth Winters arrived from Nashville later that same day. Elizabeth was younger than the other two, with fiery red hair partially hidden beneath her mourning bonnet. She too carried a certificate of marriage, and she too wore a gold band with the same inscription. When the three women were finally brought face to face, they discovered that each had been visited by Thomas on different days of the week, for years, under the pretense of business travel. The scandal rocked Hollow Creek to its core. 3 wives, 3 separate lives, all maintained by one man's elaborate web of lies. The funeral nearly came to blows before Sheriff Tanner stepped in, allowing all 3 women to attend but keeping them separated. That should have been the end of Thomas Blackwood's story. A liar and a cheat, buried and forgotten. But 2 nights after the funeral, Mary Campbell woke to find Thomas sitting at the foot of their bed. "You look beautiful in black," he told her, his voice exactly as it had been in life. But his eyes were different, darker, empty in a way that made Mary's blood run cold. She thought she was dreaming until he reached out to touch her cheek with fingers that felt like ice water. Mary screamed, but when her housekeeper came running, Thomas was gone. The only evidence he'd been there at all was a wet spot on the bed sheets that smelled faintly of river water. You might think Mary was simply grieving, her mind playing tricks in the depths of her sorrow. That's what Sheriff Tanner thought too, until Josephine Miller burst into his office the next morning, white as a sheet, claiming Thomas had visited her room at the boarding house. "He wasn't right," she kept saying. "His mouth moved, but the words came from somewhere else." By the end of the week, Elizabeth had reported the same visitation. 3 widows, all haunted by the same ghost. And what Thomas asked of each of them turned a scandal into something far more sinister. Mary Campbell was the first to notice the pattern. Thomas would appear only on the same night of the week he had always visited her during his life, Sundays and Wednesdays. For Josephine, it was Mondays and Thursdays. For Elizabeth, Tuesdays and Saturdays. "Friday," Elizabeth said when the women reluctantly gathered at Mary's home to compare experiences. "He never came to any of us on Fridays." Where was he going? Josephine wondered aloud, her fingers nervously twisting her wedding band. Mary's voice was barely above a whisper when she replied, "Maybe there's a 4th wife." The possibility hung in the air like a noose. 3 women who had every reason to hate each other now bound by a shared haunting. The ghost of Thomas made the same request of each widow. "There's something I need you to find for me." To Mary, he specified a box beneath the floorboards of his office. To Josephine, he described a hidden compartment in the trunk she'd brought from their home in Knoxville. To Elizabeth, he mentioned a key sewn into the lining of the coat he'd been buried in. "Don't trust the others," the ghost told each woman. "They'll try to take what's rightfully yours." If you're wondering why these women didn't simply flee from their spectral husband, you have to understand life for a widow in 1876. Without Thomas, all three women faced uncertain futures. Mary at least had her family's support, but Josephine and Elizabeth were essentially stranded in Hollow Creek, their financial situations unclear. And beneath their fear lay another emotion: curiosity. What had Thomas hidden? What secret was worth coming back from the grave to protect? Despite the ghost's warnings, the three widows formed an uneasy alliance. They agreed to gather what Thomas had asked them to find and meet at Mary's house on a Friday night, the only night he never appeared. Mary found the box easily enough, hidden exactly where the ghost had described. Inside was a stack of documents, property deeds for land throughout eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina. Josephine's trunk concealed a pouch of gold coins and a folded map with several locations marked with red ink. But it was Elizabeth who made the most disturbing discovery. Getting the key required convincing the mortician to exhume Thomas's body, a task that cost her nearly all the money she had left. What they found shocked even the hardened gravedigger. Thomas's corpse showed no signs of decomposition. His skin was pale but intact, his limbs flexible as if he'd been buried that very day. The key was exactly where the ghost had described, and Elizabeth took it with trembling fingers, trying not to look at the face of the man who still visited her bed twice a week. The secrets of Hollow Creek run deeper than Thomas Blackwood's grave. If you're brave enough to hear what happens when the three widows finally learn the truth about their shared husband, make sure you're subscribed for the darkest tales from America's haunted past. Friday night came, and the three widows gathered around Mary's dining table, laying out their discoveries. The deeds, the gold, the map, and finally, the key. But what did the key open? "Look at the map," Mary suggested. The red marks formed a rough circle around an area in the mountains about 10 miles from Hollow Creek. "There's an old mining camp up there," Josephine said. "Thomas mentioned it once. Said it had been abandoned after a cave-in killed a dozen men." Elizabeth studied the property deeds. All these parcels form a ring around that same area. He's been buying land to surround something. The women decided they would ride out to the location the following morning. None of them wanted to admit they were afraid to wait any longer. Each night, Thomas's appearances had grown more insistent, more desperate. "He's changing," Mary confided as they prepared for sleep, the three of them sharing her large bed rather than face the night alone. "His eyes, sometimes they're not his eyes at all." The journey to the mining camp took most of the next day. They hired a local man with a wagon who knew the mountain roads, though he refused to take them all the way, claiming the old camp was cursed. "Bad business up there even before the collapse," he told them as he let them off at a fork in the overgrown path. "That whole mountain feels wrong." The women continued on foot, following the map until they reached the remains of the mining camp. Rotting wooden structures stood like skeletons against the darkening sky. The entrance to the mine itself was partially collapsed, but still passable. "We're not going in there," Josephine said firmly, but Elizabeth was already approaching the entrance, key in hand. "There's something built into the rock face," she called back. "Some kind of metal door." Mary and Josephine reluctantly followed. Sure enough, partially hidden by fallen rocks and overgrowth, was a small iron door set directly into the stone beside the mine entrance. The key fit perfectly. Inside was a small cave that had been converted into some kind of office or study. A desk, bookshelves, and strangest of all, a bed, all illuminated by the last rays of sunlight filtering through cracks in the ceiling. "What is this place?" Mary whispered, but her question was answered as she approached the desk. Spread across it were journals, maps, and photographs. Thomas's handwriting filled page after page with observations, calculations, and increasingly disturbed ramblings. "Listen to this," Josephine said, reading from one journal. "The entity requires regular contact. It feeds on connection, on intimacy. One vessel is insufficient. It weakens the host too quickly." Elizabeth had found something else. A daguerreotype showing a group of miners standing at the entrance to the mine. In the background, barely visible in the shadows of the entrance, was a tall, thin figure with features too blurred to make out. "Look at the date," she said, her voice shaking. 1851, 25 years ago. Mary was flipping through another journal. There are records here going back decades. Different handwriting, different names, but the same pattern. Men who came to operate the mine, who married local women, who established separate households in different towns. "And this," she continued, holding up a page filled with a familiar script. "Thomas's writing from 5 years ago, when he first came to Tennessee. It says, 'I am not the first Thomas Blackwood.' I found his journals in an abandoned mining office in Colorado. I thought they were fiction, the ravings of a madman, until I started having the dreams, until I felt it inside me, guiding my hand as I write these very words." As the sun set over the mountains of eastern Tennessee, 3 widows realized a terrible truth. Their husband hadn't been a man at all, at least not entirely. Something had been wearing Thomas Blackwood like a suit, something that had worn other men before him, something that had been feeding on human connection for decades. And as darkness fell completely, they heard footsteps on the path outside. Heavy footsteps that somehow sounded like they were coming from 3 different men, all walking in perfect unison. "We need to leave," Mary said, gathering the journals. "Now." But when they turned toward the door, a figure blocked their exit. It had Thomas's face, but all 3 women immediately recognized that whatever was looking at them through those eyes was not their husband. "My wives," it said in Thomas's voice, but with an unnatural resonance that seemed to come from the walls of the cave itself. "You found each other. How inconvenient." "What are you?" Elizabeth demanded, her fear giving way to anger. The thing wearing Thomas's face smiled. "I've had many names over many years. The miners who first broke into my resting place called me a devil. The native people before them considered me a spirit of the mountain. But I prefer to think of myself as a collector." "A collector of what?" Josephine asked. "Connections, bonds, the invisible threads that tie one soul to another." It gestured to the 3 of them, particularly the unique bond of husband and wife. So much delicious emotion, love, resentment, obligation, desire. The creature took a step closer, its movements jerky, as if it hadn't quite mastered the use of human limbs. "Thomas Blackwood was already dead when you met him," it continued. "His body was broken in that mine in Colorado. I merely repurposed it, just as I've repurposed so many others over the centuries." Mary clutched the journals to her chest. "The Friday disappearances. You were looking for new bodies." The thing nodded, looking almost proud. "This form is failing. 5 years is typically the limit before decay becomes problematic. I need a fresh vessel." It looked between the 3 women with hungry eyes. "And I need my wives. All of you. The arrangement has always worked so well. Different homes, different nights. It keeps the feeding sustainable." Josephine stepped forward. "We are not your wives." "We were married to a lie." The creature laughed, a sound like stones grinding together. "Oh, but you are. The vows you made were real. 'Till death do us part.' But death never parted us, did it? Thomas has been dead all along." As it spoke, the flesh of its face seemed to shift, revealing glimpses of something ancient and inhuman beneath the familiar features of Thomas Blackwood. "I allowed you to find this place because it's time for a new beginning. A new Thomas. And I've already selected him." It gestured toward the door. Sheriff Tanner has been so helpful, searching for answers about your mysterious husband. He'll make an excellent replacement." The women exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Whatever their differences, whatever pain Thomas had caused them, they were united in one thing. They would not allow this creature to continue its cycle. "What do you need from us?" Mary asked, her voice steady despite her fear. The thing smiled wider, its teeth suddenly too numerous to fit in a human mouth. "Just your consent, your invitation. The bonds between us must be acknowledged willingly. That's the rule." "And if we refuse?" Elizabeth asked. The creature's face darkened. "Then I take what I need by force. It's not as nutritious that way, but it will suffice." Outside, they could hear Sheriff Tanner calling their names, his voice growing closer. Mary stepped forward, the journals still clutched to her chest. "Before we decide, I want to understand. These records, they go back so far. How many women have you done this to?" The creature preened with grotesque pride. "Dozens, hundreds over the years. Sometimes 3, sometimes 4 at once. The more connections, the stronger I become." While it was distracted by its boasting, Josephine had been slowly moving toward the desk where an oil lamp burned. With a sudden movement, she grabbed it and hurled it at the creature. The glass shattered, dousing Thomas's body in flaming oil. The thing screamed, a sound no human throat could make. It clawed at its burning flesh, its features melting to reveal something underneath that resembled nothing earthly. "The journals!" Elizabeth shouted. "Burn them all!" Mary hesitated only briefly before tossing the books she held into the spreading flames. The women worked quickly, feeding every page, every record into the fire as the creature thrashed and howled. "You fools!" it shrieked. "Without me, you have nothing. No husband, no security, no future." Mary stood tall, watching as the fire consumed the last physical links to the thing that had pretended to be her husband. "We have ourselves, and each other. That's more than enough." The ceiling of the cave began to collapse as the fire spread, ancient timbers giving way. The 3 women rushed for the exit, nearly colliding with Sheriff Tanner as he arrived at the mine. "Get back!" Josephine shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him away from the entrance just as a massive section of the mountainside came crashing down, sealing the burning chamber and the creature inside it. The story of what happened at the old mine never spread beyond the 4 people who witnessed it. Sheriff Tanner, perhaps wisely, decided that some truths were better left buried under tons of rock. The 3 widows of Thomas Blackwood did something unusual for women of their time. They stayed together. Using the property deeds and gold, they established a small boarding house in Hollow Creek that catered to travelers passing through the mountains. The locals gossiped, of course. 3 women living together, running a business without a man's guidance. It wasn't proper, but the widows paid no mind to such talk. At night, they would sit on the porch of their establishment, watching the distant mountain where the mine lay sealed. On rare occasions, when the moon was dark, they thought they could hear something. A distant, muffled howl of rage coming from deep within the earth. "Do you think it's truly gone?" Elizabeth would sometimes ask. Mary would take her hand, and Josephine's too, forming a circle of shared strength. "No," she would answer honestly, "but neither are we." And if any of the widows sometimes woke in the night to find a familiar shape sitting at the foot of her bed, eyes burning with inhuman malice, well, that was something they kept to themselves. Some hauntings, they had learned, were simply the price of survival in a world that offered women precious few choices. The mountain stands there still, silent and unyielding. The mine remains closed, the entrance long since reclaimed by forest. But ask any local about the old Blackwood boarding house, and they might share a curious detail: how for over 30 years the 3 widows who ran it never once accepted guests on Fridays. Some secrets are better left buried, some bonds can never truly be broken, and some ghosts, no matter how deeply entombed, are simply waiting for someone to break the seal.